Ever notice how some people seem to have an invisible force field around them? They speak once and people adjust. They interrupt them less. They cancel on them less. They take their boundaries seriously without pushback. And the strange part is, they're not more confident, louder, or more aggressive. They're just not sending one specific signal that most people send constant. There's a behavior wired so deeply into how we communicate that pointing it out feels almost rude. But once you see it, you can't unsee it. And once you understand what it signals to other people's brains, you understand why certain people get treated one way and others get treated completely differently. This isn't about confidence tricks or power moves. It's about how human brains process social information. What we think we're communicating versus what other people's nervous systems are actually receiving. The pattern shows up everywhere, in meetings, in friendships, in family dynamics, at the coffee shop, in email exchanges. Same words, same intentions, but wildly different outcomes based on one invisible factor most people never know: the overexplanation signal watch. What happens when someone makes a simple statement about their availability? Person A: I can't make it Thursday. Person B: I can't make it Thursday because my sister's visiting and we already made plans 2 weeks ago, and I never get to see her since she lives across the country. And it's just this one time and I feel terrible, but I really can't reschedule. Same message, completely different reception. Here's what most people don't realize. The human brain interprets explanation length as uncertainty level. When someone overexplains, they're broadcasting, I'm not sure I have the right to say no, so let me convince you why my reason is valid enough. The listener's brain receives this as negotiable. Their nervous system registers the justification reflex and automatically categorizes the boundary as watch it happen in real time. Someone asks for a favor. The person who says not available gets acceptance. The person who launches into explanation gets pushback. The explainer thinks they're being considerate. The listener's brain hears, keep pushing, there's room here. This creates a feedback loop. The more someone explains, the more they get questioned. The more they get questioned, the more they feel they need to explain. Notice workplace dynamics. Someone presents an idea. I think we should go with option B. Versus, I think we should go with option B because I looked at the data and it seems like maybe this could work better, and I know option A has merit too. But I just feel like if we consider all the factors, then possibly B makes more sense. The first person sounds decisive. The second sounds like they're seeking permission for their own opinion. The brain doesn't process these the same way. The first gets treated as information. The second gets treated as a proposal needing approval. Here's where it gets interesting. The second person often has better reasoning, more thorough analysis, deeper thought. But by packaging it in justification language, they signal their conclusion is uncertain. So it gets treated as uncertain. The irony is, the people who explain the least are often the ones who've thought the most. This isn't about being brief or rude. It's about the difference between stating and justifying. Stating assumes you have the right to your position. Justifying suggests you're not quite sure you do. The apology prefix. There's another version of this same signal, even more automatic. Listen to how many statements begin with sorry. Sorry, quick question. Sorry to bother you, but sorry, do you have a second? What's actually being apologized for? Existing, taking up space, having needs. Here's the mechanism. Human brains are wired to respond to apologies by assigning fault. When someone says sorry, our nervous system automatically tries to identify what wrong occurred. The subconscious processes. Sorry equals, this person did something wrong, equals lower status position. Watch group settings. 10 people in a meeting. 5 preface contributions with sorry. 5 don't. The ones who apologize for speaking get interrupted more, get dismissed faster, have their ideas attributed to others. The sorry preface primes everyone's brain to categorize that input as less important. Notice how people ask questions. I'm confused about the timeline gets a straightforward answer. Sorry, I'm probably missing something obvious, but I'm confused about the timeline gets dismissed or ignored. The apology signals the question is an imposition. The listener's brain receives permission to treat it as such. Notice the difference between these two approaches to the same situation. Someone needs information. Version A, what's the deadline for this? Version B, sorry, I know you probably already said this, But what's the deadline again? Sorry. Version A treats the need for information as legitimate. Version B treats it as a social burden that requires multiple apologies. The person using version B usually thinks they're being more polite, more considerate, more aware of other people's time. But what they're actually doing is training everyone around them to perceive their needs as optional, as interruptions rather than legitimate requests. This compounds over time. The more someone apologizes for normal interactions, the more people unconsciously categorize them as lower priority, which leads to more dismissive treatment, which often leads to more apologizing, trying to smooth over the perceived rudeness of existing. The silence question. Here's where the pattern shows up in a way that's harder to see because it happens so fast. Something uncomfortable gets said. A criticism, a challenging question, an awkward silence. Most people immediately rush to fill it. They explain, defend, smooth things over, make it comfortable again. But there's a power dynamic embedded in who manages the discomfort. When someone makes you uncomfortable, and you immediately work to resolve that discomfort, you've just signaled who's responsible for the emotional temperature of the interaction. You are, not them, you. Watch this in manager-employee conversations. Manager gives critical feedback. Employee immediately starts explaining, justifying, filling every second of silence with words. The manager just sits there, comfortable in the quiet. What's happening beneath the surface? The employee's rush to fill silence signals that they're responsible for managing the manager's emotional comfort. The manager's comfort with silence signals they're not responsible for managing the employees. This isn't about being cold or playing games. It's about what silence means in social dynamics. Silence is discomfort. Whoever tolerates discomfort better holds the power in that moment. Whoever rushes to eliminate discomfort first is signaling they're lower in the social hierarchy. Notice how this shows up in negotiations. Someone makes an offer. Two possible responses. Response A, silence. Just sitting there, looking at them, waiting. Response B, immediate reaction. Well, the thing is, or let me explain why, or here's what I'm thinking. Response. A makes the other person uncomfortable. They start explaining, justifying, improving their offer. Response B relieves their discomfort immediately and removes any pressure on them to reconsider. The person who can't tolerate silence loses negotiating power. Not because of strategy, but because their discomfort with quiet is visible. And visible discomfort is readable as lower confidence. This pattern appears in conflict too. Someone says something critical or challenging. The person who immediately defends or explains is managing the critic's comfort. The person who just sits with it for 3 seconds before responding is making the critic sit with their own words. Same dynamic in different contexts. Someone asks an invasive question. Immediate detailed answer equals you accept their right to that information. Brief pause, then short answer or redirect equals you're comfortable with their slight discomfort at not getting full access. Most people experience the impulse to fill silence as politeness, as social lubrication, as being a good communicator. But silence tolerance is actually a form of boundary. It's saying, I'm not responsible for making this comfortable for you. The interesting thing is that people who can tolerate silence don't actually create more awkwardness long term. They create more respect because they're not managing everyone else's emotional experience at the expense of their own position. The validation loop. There's one more way this same signal appears, and it connects back to over-explaining in an interesting way. Notice how some people make decisions. They decide something. Then they tell people about it. Present tense, done deal. Others make decisions and then immediately seek input. What do you think? Does that make sense? Is that the right call? Not actually asking for advice. Asking for validation that their decision is acceptable. The validation seeking seems like collaboration, like being thoughtful, like respecting other people's opinions. But here's what's actually happening. When you make a decision and then ask if it's okay, you've just transferred the authority for that decision to whoever you're asking. Even if they say, yeah, sounds good, the social structure of the interaction has established that your decisions need external approval. This is really just another form of over-explaining. Except instead of justifying after the fact, You're justifying in real time by seeking permission. Someone decides to change careers. They tell one friend, I'm switching to teaching. They tell another friend, I'm thinking about switching to teaching. What do you think? Same decision. Completely different social positioning. The first frames it as information. The second frames it as something that needs approval before it's real. Watch how people respond. To the first person, oh, wow, that's exciting. When do you start? To the second person, really? Are you sure? Have you thought about? The decision itself hasn't changed, but the way it's presented changes, whether people treat it as real or as something still up for debate. This pattern creates a strange dynamic. The more someone seeks validation for their choices, the less people trust those choices. Not consciously. But there's a subconscious association between needing approval and being uncertain. Notice it in everyday decisions too. I'm going to order the pasta versus I'm thinking the pasta, what are you getting? The first is a statement. The second is actually asking, is my food choice acceptable? Seems minor. But these micro-validations add up. Every time someone presents their preference as something that needs social approval, they're training the people around them to see their judgment as questionable. The person seeking validation usually thinks they're being open-minded, collaborative, humble, but what they're broadcasting is, I don't trust my own decisions until someone else confirms they're okay. And once that's the established pattern, people start treating all of their decisions that way, even the good ones, even the well-thought-out ones, because the validation seeking has become the signal, not the quality of the actual decision. What all this means. These patterns aren't separate behaviors. They're all versions of the same core signal, uncertainty about whether you have the right to your own position. Over-explaining broadcasts. I'm not sure this is valid. Apologizing for existing broadcasts. I'm not sure I belong here. Filling silence broadcasts. I'm responsible for everyone's comfort but my own. Seeking validation broadcasts. I can't trust this until you approve. None of these things are consciously calculated by the people receiving these signals. They're just how human social processing works. We're constantly reading each other's confidence and certainty levels through these tiny behavioral cues. Most people think respect comes from being understood. It doesn't. It comes from being clear. The interesting part is that changing these patterns isn't about becoming a different person. It's about noticing the gap between what you mean to communicate and what's actually being received. When you stop over-explaining, you're not becoming less considerate. You're just no longer accidentally broadcasting uncertainty. When you stop apologizing for normal needs, you're not becoming rude. You're just no longer signaling that your existence is a burden. When you stop filling every silence, you're not becoming cold. You're just no longer accepting responsibility for everyone else's emotional comfort. When you stop seeking validation for decisions you've already made, you're not becoming arrogant. You're just no longer undermining your own judgment. These aren't techniques to practice. They're patterns to notice. Once you start noticing these signals, you can't unsee them. You'll hear them in your own voice, in other people's, in meetings, in texts, in casual conversations. And the moment you stop sending them, conversations start feeling different, without you ever saying a word about respect. People adjust, they interrupt less, they take your boundaries seriously, they treat your time differently. Not because you demanded it, because you stopped accidentally signaling that it was optional.